My name is Jess Fanzo, and I am a professor of climate and food at the Columbia Climate School, which is right nearby. I'm also the director of Food for Humanity, and I'm really pleased to be talking about farming, food, and climate uncertainty. And I have some fantastic guests with me. Courtney Thompson here is a managing director of Morgan Stanley in the Global Sustainability Office based here in New York. As head of sustainable products and solutions, she leads the development of innovative sustainable finance products and advice for clients across the firm's institutional securities, investment management, and wealth management divisions. She is a graduate of Columbia's business school here. So welcome, Courtney. And next we have Vincent Gauthier. He told me to say his name is Goats, yay. I like goats. The senior manager for climate smart agriculture at the Environmental Defense Fund and a thought leader on agriculture finance solutions that help farmers and ranchers adapt to a very volatile, changing climate. Vincent collaborates directly with farmers, ranchers, and agriculture lenders to identify and address financial challenges to climate solutions in the ag sector. So thank you both for taking the time to be here. So we often say climate risk is investment risk, but in agriculture, timelines are long, returns can be murky, and the ecosystem is quite fragmented. What does a truly climate-aligned agriculture investment look like? And maybe Vincent, to you, can you talk about that from a farmer's perspective? What would that look like? And from Courtney, an investor's perspective. So let's start with Courtney.
Sure. Like you said, very proud alum of Columbia Business School, so really great to be back and see so many familiar faces. So thanks for having me. I think with this question, I can start to narrow the funnel and then pass it to Vincent, who is quite literally on the ground working with farmers. But from our perspective, if you think about it, thinking about my role at Morgan Stanley and the range of corporates and investors we work with, as I'm sure you've heard throughout the conference so far today, there's a lot of considerations that go into climate smart investments. I think increasingly investors, whether they label themselves as a climate investor, a sustainable investor, or just a long-term investor, are increasingly thinking about both the risks and the opportunities. I think thinking about sustainable agriculture and farming, investors are also increasingly aware of the impacts on biodiversity and nature loss. Right? I think the statistics tell us that while the food system contributes to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions, it also the current food system contributes to 70% of biodiversity loss globally. So I think increasingly climate smart investors are looking at both sides of this coin, both from a risks perspective, which I know is the theme for today, but also on the opportunity side. And I think the key, as we think about both climate smart investing risks and agriculture, is making sure that there is a key focus on resilience. And three aspects of that I'd elaborate before passing over is I think all these investments need to be financially resilient, right? You might need to think about new and different financial models, whether that's blended capital stacks or otherwise, to make sure that the nuances and the long-term nature of the food system is taken into account. They need to be climate resilient, thinking about what are the different physical climate risks that might impact different geographies, even if they're very closely located, what are the differences? And then I think there's also a social component too. I think food systems are so ingrained into the cultural fabrics of different areas, different cultures. They're very complex value chains. And so I think taking that into account and also being conscious of where in the food system you're making an investment. Is it at the point of the farmer, or is it perhaps beyond that as well until it gets to our tables and our shelves?
And to that point, Courtney, about the social aspects of agriculture and food and how this is really just the livelihoods in the countryside here in North America, but across the world, it's really critical that climate-aligned finance and other types of business solutions really start with understanding the needs of farmers that we are aiming to support in transitioning to climate-adapted and climate-mitigating solutions. So in my mind, the climate-aligned solutions, especially in agricultural lending, which is what I work on, the solutions I work on developing, I want you to picture this scenario. Imagine you're a corn and soybean farmer in Iowa. You operate on 1,000 acres of pretty flat land in Iowa. And your main financial partner in helping you get through the ups and downs of weather shocks, the fact that you have to spend all of your money before you can then get it back at the end of the year if you're able to grow a crop, is your agricultural lender. And this lender has been financing your operation for decades, back when your father was running the operation and now that you're running the operation. And in this perfect scenario, your agricultural lender and his association or her association have undertaken strong climate risk assessments and understand in your part of Iowa that spring flooding and increasing threats of spring flooding are really going to impact your business, because when your fields are flooded in the spring, you can't go out and plant your crop, which means that you're going to have lower yield and lower revenue come the fall. And so they understand that. And they've developed financing solutions to help you transition to practices like reduced tillage or cover cropping that keeps the soil covered during the winter time, that helps your soil and your operation be able to mitigate some of that risk and be able to plant sooner in those wet conditions. Now, your lending institution has options for you to take out a low interest loan that spans a longer term horizon for you to be able to transition with these practices. Maybe they even have a recoverable grant program that allows you to have more equity and working capital during this time of implementing a practice that you've never implemented before and may present a lot of financial risk to your operation. Maybe that lending institution is partnered with a company, a PepsiCo, that buys corn from your co-op to provide a warranty that protects you against any losses you might face if you reduce the nitrogen fertilizer amount that you plant on your crop, a main solution for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. This is the type of picture we want to create for farmers, where all of their financing partners on their operation are proactively supporting them and de-risking the transition to climate mitigation and adaptation solutions. And I think we're not far away. And I'm really optimistic that the financing partners in the agriculture sector are 18 months, 6 months in some cases, and the leaders away from really developing that ecosystem around farmers.
I'm so glad you're being positive. Maybe to put it a bit in perspective, our food systems are highly constrained, and maybe you're asking why are we even having a food panel? And Courtney had said about 30% of greenhouse gases are coming from food systems and the way they're managed. But I want you to all keep in mind that food systems not only are drivers of climate change and environmental degradation, but they are victims of climate change. Food systems are experiencing tons of shocks, and we'll talk about that. Vincent will talk about that, what that means for the farmer. Food systems aren't delivering on the things we want them to: better livelihoods, climate resilience, environmental sustainability, better nutrition and health. So there's a need for investment in this space, and we'll get into that a bit. Courtney, Morgan Stanley is financing a range of what are called nature-based solutions, which I hope you define for the audience, across food systems. Food system people are like filled with acronyms and strange terms. Could you give us a snapshot of the types of ag and nature-based and land-based models that are getting funded right now, and what makes those financially viable?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And if food systems are full of jargon and words, finance is very full of that as well. So I think this audience is well placed for both of it. But as we've pursued and addressed client demand and interest in nature-based solutions, it's been clear that we need to start with what is that? How do we define it? What does that mean for a financial markets audience? And I would say the way that we've broken this down is two kind of intersecting rows. One is if you think about what are the approaches to nature-based solutions. One, and the one that I think was kind of the 101 level when you think about nature, is about conservation and restoration, right? Thinking about landscapes and keeping them in a way that they were designed and that they can be robust and flourish. And there's a place for that and a lot of need for that. There's also the second approach, which is about sustainably managing our resources, right? And food systems are probably the key prime example of that. We are going to be reliant on nature for food, much like timber and other natural assets. But how do we manage them sustainably? So we know that the revenue model there is going to require the sale of goods that come from nature. And then a third approach to think about nature-based solutions is all of the other things that rely on reducing pollution, waste prevention, that drive biodiversity loss. So pollution, circular economy, these are all broader solutions that are critical to nature-based solutions. So it's been helpful for clients and investors, I think, to break that down into those three approaches. And then also think about what are the natural assets that you're supporting or investing in. I think today's conversation is very much about land, but land is different than forested land, is different than marine and coastal ecosystems, is different than freshwater ecosystems, and is different from wildlife. And I think if you're intentional about where your investment strategies are, whether it's a single asset or an ecosystem that requires all of them, I think that helps inform making sure the investments are both climate smart and resilient in all the right ways. And I think it's worth noting that food systems, while I think today we'll focus on land-based food systems, a huge amount of the food system globally is marine and coastal and freshwater as well, which has its own unique challenges. The snapshot of
Say what maybe a couple of those challenges are from
the ocean.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's different livelihoods that are unique in coastal ecosystems, right? You think about flooding is a very different phenomenon on coastal ecosystems than on land. In some cases, there's many of the same solutions, but the need for weather data and patterns, the need for coastal resilience, whether those are mangrove or other natural barriers or man-made barriers, are key and different ones. And I think there's also another interesting element around ecotourism as well that happens more in coastal ecosystems where we all like to be. Those are a couple that we've seen. There's many, many more. But as far as what gets financed, I mean, just a couple, and as a caveat, I mean, Morgan Stanley is not the biggest ag lender. There's many other financial institutions, many that you work with, that are on the ground doing this in a bigger way. But for us and the breadth of global clients that we serve, there's examples on the corporate and the sovereign and government sector where they're raising capital in their thinking about how they will finance their supply chains, right? You've mentioned some of the larger consumer companies. Again, they're thinking about long-term resilience of their supply chains, where they will allocate the CapEx or OpEx across their supply chains to make sure that they have access to the inputs that they need, but in a way that is resilient for the long term and investing in the stakeholders that they need. We also have a number of individual investors. We do some surveys every year through our Institute for Sustainable Investing and find that individual investors are very interested in nature and biodiversity in addition to climate, specifically in sustainable ag. And so our wealth management division offers a number of thematic products and data for clients to understand where they're investing in, let's say, water solutions or biodiversity solutions. And then our investment teams also invest across the value chain, right? Whether those are in public companies that they engage with and evaluate from if they're working in the food supply chain, and then also investing down into private earlier stage companies. And I think it's very interesting that we have a dedicated climate fund on the private markets, and one of the 4 key areas for that fund is sustainable food and agriculture. So I think that really speaks to the fact that this is core to the climate conversation, obviously today and many other conversations beyond this room as well.
So Vincent, you work closely with farmers and ranchers on climate smart practices. I mean, what do you see as the most significant climate risks that they face, and how well are those risks currently reflected in the financial system? And maybe for the audience, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the Food Systems Economic Commission estimates that the hidden costs of the food system is $15 trillion a year. 11 trillion the health system absorbs. And they don't really calculate biodiversity loss. It's very difficult to calculate that loss from a financial perspective. Should farmers be absorbing these hidden costs? Should consumers, should investors? It's a huge question, but from your perspective, what are these risks that farmers are facing, and how much should they be absorbing?
I'll kind of take your question backwards. So from a financing perspective, 2 years ago, we surveyed a global set of agricultural lending institutions about climate risks and what they've done internally to understand and manage climate risks, all the way down to their engagements and relationships with agricultural producers around the world. And we found that 87% of agricultural lending institutions that we surveyed expect climate change to present a material risk to their business. But at the time, only 24% of those respondents were actively considering climate in their critical business decisions. So there's a clear gap. And while food companies have an opportunity to manage some of those risks in agriculture by having different supply chains in different regions around the world, being able to hedge on some of those risks. Farmers can't. Their piece of land where they generate revenue through a nature-based production system can't up and leave when there's a climate risk in their region. And in many cases, agricultural lending institutions that are farmers' first financial partners, they also can't up and leave. Mm-hmm. If you think in the US, about half of all agricultural lending is done by the farm credit system. The farm credit system, each entity has a territory in which they are allowed to lend under their status with the federal government. And they can only lend to agriculture and associated businesses. Their climate risk, they can't up and leave, and they can't just switch to lending to another industry. They are stuck with managing that climate risk. So then when we ask them, like, have you modeled climate risk to your portfolio given that you can't up and leave? Only 34% of the surveyed respondents had conducted some form of climate modeling or climate risk assessment. So that's why over the next couple of days, we're going to be starting to share with the major agricultural lending institutions a climate risk modeling tool and data set that we've developed to help them kind of get past that starting point of understanding the climate risks to their portfolios. And what we found, getting back to your question of like, what are these risks and how imminent and how big are they? In the region of Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, a lot of corn, soybean production in those areas. The model projected that there's about a 30% decline in corn yields that we're going to see between 2020 and 2050 if our management systems don't adapt. And if you think north of the border in Canada, in the Canadian prairies, canola production is expected to see up to 35% in declines in crop yields. So there's significant risk that right now is in the hands of producers and the insurance systems. In the case of the United States, mostly a private-public partnership, but a lot of that cost is coming from the federal government. There's a lot of risk, and that's where it's being held. And the key financial partners to farmers haven't really understood those risks and started working on the solutions to help farmers, but then the rest of the supply chain that the farmer relies on to adapt to those changing climate impacts and risks.
So let's talk a little bit about the help piece. You're working on a lot of tools to help farmers produce more climate smart ag. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah.
The tools you're working
on. Yeah, some of the ag lending solutions that we've been trying to develop so that we change that, what is happening today with those numbers I told you from that survey, to a point where we have that beautiful picture of what I started with, where the financial partners to farmers and ranchers across the US, North America, and the world are aligned in providing the support that they need. We have seen over the last 5 years, and in part due to our advocacy at Environmental Defense Fund and some of our partners, from a starting point 5 years ago where those ag lending partners were like, that's not our problem. Like, food companies, they have consumers that care about these climate issues, but we just provide, operating lines of credit to our farmers. It's not our deal. To now we're at a point where there are a few good examples of proactive financing solutions for farmers to adapt to climate change and for mitigation solutions as well. And I think we're on, as I said earlier, we're on the brink of like the major agricultural lending institutions really putting out a proactive solution for their customers. So in 2022, Farmers Business Network, much more of a small player innovator, launched their regenerative ag financing program. It's grown to a $50 million program on top for operating lines of credit, and then $50 million for land loans. Last year, we helped CoBank, which is one of the largest ag lenders in the US, create its first sustainability-linked loan for a grain co-op in Iowa, and they're planning on growing that option to a larger set of agricultural cooperatives across the US. We're also working with Farm Credit Canada north of the border. They're developing a holistic approach to their financing of the agricultural supply chains, including farmers and ranchers all the way down the supply chain to provide sustainable finance solutions for their customers across the supply chain. And I think the big thing that we're working on right now, I had conversations with some of the biggest ag lenders here in New York yesterday about some of these solutions, is helping bring together, leverage the funding that is in place at major food companies that have been trying to achieve their sustainability and regenerative agriculture goals, leverage that funding to bring along the $560 billion ag lending industry in the US, so the financing in the supply chain, the financing at the farmer level is aligned towards the same goals and overcoming the barriers that producers face in transitioning to climate smart agriculture.
It's very nice lights, shining hopes there. So Courtney, I think, when I think about corn and soy farmers in Iowa, I'm thinking massive scale. If anyone's visited some of these farms, some of them are family farms, which sounds quaint, but these are not quaint farms. They're producing a lot of food, right?
But some of them are still family farms, to be clear.
Some are family farms.
It's not a yeah.
Family farm does not equal smallholder farms necessarily. Yeah. But there are a lot of smallholder farms in the world, less traditional ranches, pastoralists, other kind of rural farm workers in our global food system. Smallholder farmers are some of the custodians of the world's biodiversity, so they're critically important, less invested in. So Courtney, how do we ensure that some of these tools, but the climate smart investments in particular, don't just benefit the large landholders and institutional players, but they're tapping into some of these smallholder farms? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really important question, and it's one that comes up often with our clients who are really, deeply committed to impact investing and really understanding the positive impacts of their investments. And we've had some really recent and interesting discussions with roundtables of stakeholders across that ecosystem, right? Folks who are helping with that last mile distribution and collection to smallholder farmers, folks who are in other aspects of the food supply chain as well. And I think there's a few key elements that are required to think about how to make the transition to a more sustainable food system a reality for the full value chain down to smallholder farmers. And the one kind of caveat or overarching comment I would also say is, at the end of the day, ultimately these solutions do need to have an eye towards scale. Ultimately, that will benefit some of the institutional players, but it's really in service of making sure the full value chain works together. If you're investing in solutions that will always remain kind of niche and they won't scale, ultimately that's not financially sustainable for the farmers, the lenders, and everyone involved. So there always has to be kind of an eye towards scale. But in the current kind of state of the market in many places, I think a few key elements to address your question are, I think, one, being very intentional about impact measurement, and that can mean a lot of things. But what gets measured gets managed. And so I think understanding what is the key impact that will be measured at the smallholder farmer level. I think two is acknowledging, as you mentioned, the vast majority of farmer finance in the US, but also internationally, comes through whether it's food co-ops, ag lending, local institutions. It's a really complex and trust-based system. And so I think to make these solutions work, they have to be done in partnership with the lenders and the partners that farmers, whether they be family-owned or smallholder, know and trust. And so I think that creates some complexity, but is really important ultimately for the long term. And I think that really requires that public-private partnership in many cases, and sometimes a blended capital stack or a willingness to bring multiple sources of finance together to make that work. And I think also, right, we'd be remiss if we didn't address some of the other macro trends happening around AI development and technology development, right? If these can be rolled out and need to be rolled out in a way that is intentional, and Vincent probably has more on-the-ground experience with some of these, but whether it's precision ag, precision irrigation, some of these other important tools, making sure that they're accessible and well understood, and that the promise of them really is accretive to the full value chain at the end of the day.
Yeah, the whole AI, the equity piece of ensuring that that's distributed in a way that's fair for everybody. I'm going to get a little political, but what's on the minds of your clients and stakeholders with the current policy environment? We can't not talk about that, and we'll talk about it very briefly. I'm getting a little bit of the flag, and its potential impacts on food systems and climate. Maybe just touch on it briefly, and then we'll end on a positive note. Vincent, what are your thoughts with the current political environment and how your work's playing out within that?
Yeah, I've been speaking to recently for one of the projects we're working on with rice farmers in Arkansas. And one thing that is really clear when you talk to farmers is that they want to compete in selling their products in strong markets. And we've tried to provide that opportunity to farmers around sustainability, to create markets where their sustainability attributes become part of what they are selling in the market. Some of the pullback that we've seen in the US policy environment takes away that priority of making sustainability embedded in the market. And so while producers are willing to receive some of the direct payments from the federal government that will be coming over the next couple of months in order to make their ends meet, they'd much prefer having a strong market to compete in to make ends meet for their operation. And our current policy environment is making it difficult for that to be the way that they succeed.
Courtney, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think two things that come to mind in the current market environment are certainly the uncertainty around timing and impacts, obviously, of tariff policy, of international trade, and whether that, from an investment perspective, particularly those who are looking to make impact investments across the sustainable agriculture landscape, and where do you make those investments as you think about where this food supply chain may evolve, right? Their current farmers today obviously are not up and leaving. But as you think about what are the future revenue models and markets in which those products will be sold, I think there's some uncertainty that's certainly weighing on investors. And I think also just thinking about, again, the regulation and use of potential positive impacts of AI as well that could support some of this. But I think some of the uncertainty is probably one of the bigger questions across the value chain.
Okay, maybe 1 minute to each of you. We'll end positively, as I promised. What's one thing in the food system space? Could be an idea, could be a region or a country or even a local community, a policy, a data set. Vincent, I know you got a lot of data, you both do, that you think is hugely underappreciated or overlooked, but deserves a lot more attention from investors, policymakers, or the public. Start with you, Courtney.
Oof, I was thinking about this and it's tough for me to pick one. I think maybe another one, just to throw out a topic we haven't discussed, but I think the topic of food waste is one that is critically important and often overlooked. I think particularly in last mile, in developing markets, I think the amount of food waste that happens in that last mile, whether it's just the lack of cold chain storage and transportation, I think is something that both contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. There's financial loss that happens there. I think is a really important piece of the broader food supply chain that needs to be addressed and often isn't discussed in the same breath when thinking about kind of the agricultural implementation as well.
Yeah, and just for the audience, 30% of food that is grown is lost at the farm gate level, or wasted at the retail consumers. 30%, it's massive. And there's a lot of solutions on the table for food waste.
There are.
Yeah. Vincent, end with you. Lift us up.
Yes. Okay. The big idea that we have spent a lot of time on is agricultural methane. So methane emissions has a much stronger heating potential than carbon dioxide, especially in the near term. So those risks that were talked about earlier that we're going to face in our lifetime, that's methane. And in agriculture, we're one of the greatest sources of methane. In the cheese that you eat, the milk that you drink, the dairy sector, for example, has really great opportunities in the next couple of years to implement technologies on dairy farms, especially in places like the US, even places like India, to really curb the amount of agricultural methane from dairy production. And we're, as an organization, really excited about developing those solutions and really unlocking that opportunity to quickly change the impact that methane has on our societies over the coming decades.
Yeah, fantastic. Methane, largest contributor, livestock, feeds, breeds, vaccines, all solutions on the table that are ripe for investment. So thank you both. Thank you, everyone. And looking forward to the rest of the conference.